3 old oak trees disappeared while I was at work. By the time I got home, there were nothing but fresh stumps, piles of sawdust, and a neighbor calmly sipping wine across the fence like he'd just finished mowing his lawn. And that was the moment I realized some people honestly believe money can erase other people's property. I bought my place outside Maple Ridge in the spring of 2020, right after the market started getting crazy. It wasn't a fancy house by any stretch, just a modest ranch sitting on a little over 2 acres, tucked into what used to be dairy farmland decades ago, before developers slowly carved it into oversized residential lots. What sold me wasn't the kitchen or the garage, it was the backyard. 3 enormous white oaks stretched across the western edge of the property, trees so old the local surveyor guessed they'd been standing there since sometime after World War II. Every summer they shaded almost the entire yard, dropping just enough sunlight through the branches to make everything feel peaceful instead of dark. My daughter used to hang a rope swing from the biggest one whenever she visited with my grandkids. Squirrels chased each other through the branches every morning, and on hot July evenings I'd sit outside with a glass of iced tea listening to the wind move through those leaves. Those trees weren't landscaping. They were part of the reason that place felt like home. The vacant lot next door stayed untouched for years, nothing but grass, wildflowers, and an old split-rail fence falling apart one board at a time. I honestly hoped whoever eventually bought it would build something nice and become a good neighbor. Instead, a guy named Garrett Collins showed up. Garrett looked like the kind of man who had spent his entire life winning arguments because people got tired of listening to him. He drove a brand new Range Rover, wore expensive sunglasses even when the sky was cloudy, and always spoke with that quiet confidence rich people sometimes mistake for charm. A week after he bought the property, he introduced himself while I was mowing my lawn. He smiled, shook my hand, complimented the neighborhood, then spent 15 minutes explaining the custom contemporary home he planned to build. Flat roof, steel beams, glass walls, imported stone, infinity patio. Every sentence somehow included the phrase architect says. A few days later, I met the architect himself, a younger guy named Ethan who dressed like every tech billionaire wanted to be him. Black shirts, designer boots, electric SUV. He barely looked at my house. He just stared at my trees with narrowed eyes like they were mistakes someone forgot to erase from a blueprint. Before leaving, Garrett casually asked, "You ever think about thinning those oaks out?" I laughed because I assumed he was joking. "Not really," I said. "They're the best part of the property." He looked back toward the lot and replied, "Well, they cast quite a shadow." I shrugged. "That's kind of what trees do." Ethan chuckled politely, but I caught the look they exchanged before getting back into their SUV. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. Life went on after that. Construction permits took longer than expected. Survey flags appeared around the empty lot. Engineers came and went, and every so often I'd catch Garrett standing near the property line staring at those trees with his arms folded. Once he asked if I was absolutely certain where the boundary was. I told him I had a professional survey done when I bought the house, and every marker was still exactly where it belonged. He smiled, nodded once, and changed the subject so quickly I almost forgot we'd even talked about it. Looking back now, I should have recognized that smile. It wasn't the smile of someone accepting an answer. It was the smile of someone deciding your answer didn't matter. About 3 months later, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, I left work a little earlier than usual because a thunderstorm was supposed to roll in before sunset. I remember stopping for gas, grabbing a coffee, and thinking how nice it would be to sit on the back porch and watch the rain come through those old branches. As I turned onto my road, something immediately felt wrong. The sunlight looked brighter than it ever had. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I realized the familiar line of green towering above my fence was simply gone. I slowed the truck almost to a crawl, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but deep down I already knew they weren't, and with every foot I drove closer to my driveway. A feeling I still can't fully describe settled into my stomach, because sometimes your instincts recognize disaster long before your mind is willing to believe what you're about to see. When I pulled into my driveway, I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. It felt like my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The western side of my yard, the side that had always been shaded by those massive oaks, was completely exposed. Bright afternoon sunlight poured across the grass like someone had ripped the roof off my backyard. 3 enormous stumps sat in a row, each surrounded by fresh sawdust, broken twigs, and deep tire tracks pressed into the soil. The smell hit me next, fresh oak, sharp and sweet, the kind of smell you'd normally associate with a sawmill or a woodworking shop. Usually I love that smell. That afternoon it made me sick. There was still a tree company truck parked next door, and 2 crew members were feeding branches into a chipper. One of them looked over and gave me a friendly wave, not realizing he was waving at the owner of the trees they'd just cut down. I climbed out of my truck without saying a word at first. I walked straight toward the stumps, knelt beside the largest one, and rested my hand on the freshly cut surface. You could still feel warmth from the friction of the chainsaw. 80 years, maybe longer, reduced to a flat circle in a single afternoon. I finally walked over to the crew chief and asked, as calmly as I could, "Who hired you?" He didn't hesitate. "Owner next door." Then he pointed toward Garrett's property. Everything was approved. I asked if he had the work order. He opened the truck, grabbed a clipboard, and handed it to me without a second thought. Right there, across the bottom of the page, was Garrett Collins' signature. My stomach tightened, but oddly enough, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I handed the clipboard back, thanked the crew chief for showing it to me, and walked across the property line. Garrett was standing on what would eventually become the foundation of his future home, holding a glass of red wine while talking with Ethan. They looked almost pleased with themselves. Garrett noticed me approaching and smiled like we were about to discuss the weather. "Hey, neighbor," he called out. "Quite a day, huh?" I stopped a few feet away and asked one simple question. "Why did you cut down my trees?" He actually looked surprised that I'd ask. Not guilty, surprised. He took a sip of wine before answering. "Your trees." I nodded. "Those trees were on my property." Ethan shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet. Garrett shrugged. They were sitting right on the line. Leaves kept blowing everywhere. Roots would have interfered with construction, and honestly the architect said they ruined the view from the living room. I stared at him for a few seconds before replying, "I have a survey. They're not on the line. They're entirely on my land." Garrett's smile faded for maybe half a second before returning. "Well," he said, looking back at the empty skyline where the trees used to stand, "they're gone now. Nothing either of us can really do about it." That sentence changed everything. If he'd apologized, if he'd admitted he'd made a mistake, if he'd even pretended to care, we probably would have settled the whole thing privately. Instead, he dismissed 80 years of living history with a shrug. I simply nodded once and said, "All right." Then I turned around and walked home. Behind me, I heard him laugh softly before continuing his conversation with Ethan. That laugh echoed in my head all evening. The first thing I did was pull my closing documents from the filing cabinet in my office. Every homeowner should know where those papers are, because you never know when they'll become the most valuable documents you own. Buried inside the folder was the original certified property survey. I spread it across the dining room table and measured every notation twice. There wasn't even a close call. The nearest oak stood nearly 7 feet inside my property. The others ranged from 8 to almost 10 feet from the boundary markers. There was no misunderstanding, no gray area, no honest mistake. Someone had simply decided my property rights were less important than their building plans. Before the sun went down, I photographed every stump from every angle, every survey marker, every tire track left by the equipment, and every section of disturbed ground. The next morning, I politely asked the tree company if they'd be willing to provide a written statement confirming who hired them. The crew chief looked uncomfortable when he realized what had happened. "We would have never touched those trees if we'd known," he admitted. "We trusted the customer." He signed a statement confirming Garrett had represented the trees as his own. That piece of paper became one of the most important documents in the entire case. The following afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney, Michael Reeves, a guy I'd known casually through a local fishing club. Michael wasn't flashy. His office still had furniture that looked older than both of us, and he always carried legal files in a beat-up leather briefcase that had probably seen 30 years of courtrooms. I spread the survey, photographs, and written statement across his desk. He studied everything without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he leaned back, took off his glasses, and let out a slow breath. "Garrett made a very expensive decision." I asked how expensive. Michael smiled in a way that made me realize I still didn't understand what had actually happened. "This isn't just property damage," he explained. "This is intentional timber trespass." He pulled a state law book off his shelf and opened it to the relevant statute. Then he explained something I'd never heard before. Mature trees aren't valued like landscaping shrubs. Courts consider species, age, health, environmental value, replacement difficulty, and property impact. In cases where someone knowingly removes another person's timber without permission, damages can increase dramatically. I remember blinking at him and saying, "You're telling me those trees were worth real money?" He nodded. Very real money. A certified consulting arborist spent nearly 4 hours on my property documenting everything. He measured stump diameters, examined root systems, reviewed historical satellite imagery, estimated growth rates, and produced a report thicker than some college textbooks. His conclusions stunned even me. Based on their size, condition, species, and contribution to the property, each tree carried an appraised value that far exceeded what Garrett probably imagined. Michael looked over the report and quietly said, "I don't think your neighbor realizes what he's bought himself." A formal demand letter went out later that week. It was respectful, professional, and gave Garrett every opportunity to resolve the matter before litigation. For nearly 2 weeks, we heard nothing. Then his attorney finally responded. I expected an apology. Instead, we received a 3-page letter insisting the incident resulted from an innocent misunderstanding. Garrett was willing, the letter said, to purchase and plant 3 replacement saplings approximately 8 feet tall at his own expense. Michael finished reading, leaned back in his chair, and actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "That's like totaling someone's classic Corvette," he said, then offering to replace it with 3 bicycles. We declined the offer immediately. 3 weeks later, we filed suit. Discovery lasted months. Depositions revealed Garrett never requested an updated survey before authorizing the removal. Ethan admitted under oath that the trees blocked the architectural sight line they wanted from the planned living room. Internal emails surfaced discussing how much better the property would look once the trees were gone. Every new document painted the same picture. This wasn't confusion. It was convenience. Garrett had simply assumed paying for tree removal would be easier than asking permission. Then trial day finally arrived. Garrett walked into the courtroom wearing an expensive tailored suit, looking every bit as confident as the first day I'd met him. He smiled politely across the room as though we were attending a business meeting instead of deciding the consequences of what he'd done. For the first time since those chainsaws started cutting, I realized something important. He still believed he was going to win. Before the first witness even took the stand, I looked across the courtroom at Garrett and realized something that surprised me. He wasn't nervous. He honestly believed this was going to end with a small check, a handshake, and everyone moving on. His attorney opened by calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding, saying property lines can be confusing, construction projects move quickly, mistakes happen. Then it was our turn. Michael didn't raise his voice once. He simply walked the jury through the story one piece at a time. The survey came first, then the photographs of the stumps, then the work order bearing Garrett's signature. Finally, the consulting arborist explained exactly what had been lost. He wasn't emotional, just factual. He described healthy, mature white oaks that had taken generations to grow, explained their environmental value, their contribution to the property's market value, and why they couldn't simply be replaced with a few young saplings from a nursery. Garrett's attorney tried to argue the trees posed a future danger to the planned foundation, but when asked whether any engineering report had ever identified them as hazardous, he couldn't produce one because none existed. Then came a moment I don't think anyone in that courtroom expected. During cross-examination, Michael displayed one of the emails obtained during discovery on the large monitor. It was from Ethan to Garrett weeks before the trees were removed. The message read, "Once those oaks are out of the way, the west elevation finally opens up." That single sentence seemed to change the mood in the room. The jurors stopped taking notes and simply looked at Garrett. It wasn't about leaves falling into his yard anymore. It wasn't about confusion over a property line. It became obvious that someone had decided the view mattered more than ownership. Garrett finally took the stand himself. He insisted he believed the trees were close enough to the boundary that removing them wouldn't be an issue. Michael asked one simple question. "Before hiring the tree company, did you pay for a survey?" Garrett quietly answered, "No." "Did you ask your neighbor if he agreed to remove the trees?" "No." "Did you ask the tree company to verify ownership?" Another pause. "No." Michael nodded, thanked him, and returned to his seat. That was it. No dramatic speech. No shouting. Sometimes the truth doesn't need any help. The jury deliberated for several hours, and those hours felt longer than the previous 8 months combined. When they returned, nobody in the courtroom moved. The foreperson announced that they found Garrett responsible for the unlawful removal of the trees and awarded damages along with attorney's fees and court costs. It wasn't the largest number we had discussed during the case, but it was substantial enough that Garrett's smile disappeared for the first time since I'd known him. Outside the courthouse, he tried to approach me. "We can still work something out," he said quietly. I looked at him for a second before answering. "I tried to work something out the day you cut them down. You told me there was nothing either of us could do." Then I walked away. A few months later, I learned Garrett had put the vacant lot up for sale because he couldn't satisfy the judgment any other way. Even after selling it, he still owed money, so my attorney recorded a lien against the property for the remaining balance. About a year later, a regional builder bought the lot, planning to move forward with the modern home Garrett had always dreamed about. They invested in new plans, hired contractors, even scheduled equipment deliveries. Then the title company discovered the lien. Financing stopped. Permits stalled. Construction never began. Legally, nobody could move forward until the judgment was resolved. The land sat exactly as it was: empty grass, weathered survey stakes, and 3 old stumps slowly blending back into the earth. Every time I looked across the fence, I had mixed emotions. I never celebrated losing those trees because no amount of money could bring them back. Summer afternoons are warmer now. The birds nest somewhere else. My grandkids still ask where the swing used to hang. Those are things a courtroom can never replace. But I also learned something valuable. Respect for another person's property isn't optional. It isn't something wealth, confidence, or ambition gets to override. A simple conversation could have prevented everything. One honest apology probably would have changed the outcome. Instead, arrogance turned a dream home into an empty lot that stayed untouched year after year. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like patience, paperwork, and letting the law quietly do exactly what it was designed to do. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been sitting on that jury, would you have reached the same verdict? Or do you think Garrett deserved another chance after calling it a mistake? Let me know down in the comments because I read every one of them. And if you enjoy real stories about property disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and ordinary people standing up for what's right through legal means, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.